In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American West, a certain type of man is forged. A man who has wandered so far down the wrong path that the way back has vanished into the dust behind him. Jesse Cord was exactly that kind of man. By 34, his face was plastered on wanted posters across 4 territories. And his name was a shadow that could empty a rowdy saloon quicker than the glint of a drawn 6-shooter. He was a ghost on horseback, always riding alone. No partners to share the load, no friends to share a fire with, no attachments to tie him down. He'd become so accustomed to the solitude that he'd long since forgotten the crushing weight of it. It was just the way things were. He was 3 days south of Laramie, the sun beating down on his dusty hat, when a sound snagged his attention. It was faint, impossibly fragile, drifting from a nearby draw where a cluster of cottonwood trees huddled over a parched creek bed. His first instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, was to dismiss it. Not my business, not my problem. The world was full of noises, and none of them had ever brought him anything but trouble. He was a man who rode away from complications, not toward them, but for a reason he couldn't name, a reason that went against every rule he lived by. He found himself reining in his horse. A flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time stirred within him. Curiosity? Or maybe something else entirely. He told himself it was a mistake, that he should keep moving, but his hands guided the reins with a will of their own. He turned his horse and pointed its nose toward the sound. As he nudged his horse forward, the dry leaves and twigs crunched under its hooves, the sound echoing in the stillness. The noise grew a little clearer. It was a cry, high-pitched and desperate. It wasn't the sound of a coyote or any other creature of the wild he was familiar with. It was human. A baby. His mind reeled. A baby out here in the middle of nowhere? It was impossible. A trap, maybe? Some new, clever way for a posse to lure him in? His hand instinctively rested on the butt of his Colt, his eyes scanning the rim of the draw for any sign of movement, any glint of a rifle barrel in the sun. Every nerve was on high alert. The wilderness had taught him that the unusual was almost always synonymous with danger. Yet the crying persisted, a raw, helpless sound that seemed to slice right through the armor he'd built around his heart. He dismounted, tying his horse to a low-hanging branch, the leather of his saddle creaking in the silence between the cries. He moved with a quiet, practiced stealth, his boots making almost no sound on the hard-packed earth. Peering over a cluster of rocks, he saw it. Tucked into the hollow of a fallen cottonwood log was a crude wicker basket. And inside, wrapped in a tattered, dusty blanket, was a baby. Its tiny face was red and scrunched up as it let out another wail, a sound that seemed far too big for such a small creature. There was no one else around. No tracks, save for his own and the faint, days-old marks of a single wagon that had long since passed. No sign of a struggle, no sign of life, just this tiny, abandoned soul under the vast, indifferent sky. Jesse stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. This was a complication of a magnitude he had never encountered. He'd faced down lawmen, outlaws, and the raw fury of nature itself. But this was different. He could turn around right now, get back on his horse, and ride away. In an hour, the memory would be just another ghost to add to his collection. It was the smart thing to do, the sensible thing, the Jesse Cord thing to do. But he didn't move. He looked at the baby, its cries starting to weaken into exhausted sobs, its tiny fists clenched as if holding on to the last threads of life. He saw a vulnerability so absolute it was terrifying. He saw an innocence that he himself had lost so long ago he could barely remember what it felt like. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the basket. He knelt down, the joints in his knees cracking in protest. He was a man of action, of quick decisions and quicker draws. He wasn't a man who knelt. He reached out a calloused, sunburnt hand, a hand more familiar with the cold steel of a gun than the warmth of another living being, and hesitantly touched the baby's cheek. It was warm, alive. In that single moment, the entire trajectory of his life, the solitary path he had carved for himself, seemed to shatter. The invisible road back, the one he thought was lost forever, suddenly had a signpost. And it was this small, impossible child, crying in the wilderness. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he couldn't leave. He couldn't ride away. For the first time in a decade, Jesse Cord had a reason to head toward something, instead of just running from everything else. The weight he had stopped noticing suddenly came crashing back, but this time it felt different. This time it wasn't just his own. He gently scooped up the basket. It was surprisingly light. The baby's cries subsided into little hiccups, its wide, blue eyes blinking up at him, studying his weathered face with a strange intensity. A face that had stared down death and never flinched was now completely undone by the gaze of an infant. What was he supposed to do? He had no food for a baby, no idea how to care for one. Taking the child with him was a death sentence, for both of them. Leaving it here was a certainty of the same fate. He looked south, in the direction he'd been heading, toward the dusty, lawless towns where his name was a curse. Then he looked north, back toward Laramie, back toward the very civilization he'd been running from. He had no friends, no one to turn to. He was completely and utterly alone, except for the tiny, helpless life now in his hands. With a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his past sins, he made a decision. It wasn't a decision born of logic or strategy, but of an impulse he didn't understand. He carefully secured the basket to his saddle, a clumsy, awkward process for a man whose movements were usually so fluid and precise. The baby started to fuss again, and Jesse found himself humming a tune, a broken, half-remembered lullaby from a childhood he'd tried to bury. His voice was rough, unused to softness, but the baby quieted, its eyes slowly drifting shut. Jesse swung himself into the saddle, his horse shifting restlessly beneath the new, strange arrangement. He took one last look at the empty draw, then turned the horse. But he didn't ride south. He didn't ride north. He chose a new direction, a path off the trail, heading into the unknown. For the first time since he could remember, Jesse Cord wasn't just running, he was carrying something precious. And in the harsh, unforgiving West, that was the most dangerous thing of all. His life of solitude was over. A new, far more complicated journey had just begun. He found her 30 yards in, just off the dusty trail where the sun beat down mercilessly. A young woman, barely 20, half hidden by the tangled roots of a cottonwood. She was past help, he could see that in an instant. The life was already draining from her, a slow, inevitable tide, but not yet gone. And in her arms, bundled against the harshness of the world, was a baby. A newborn, maybe a day old, if that. And alive. A tiny, miraculous flicker of life in the face of death. Her eyes, clouded with pain, found his face. There was a desperate focus in them, the kind only a dying woman can have. She didn't waste breath asking who he was or what he was doing there. Names and reasons didn't matter anymore. She had only enough strength for 3 things, 3 words that would echo in his soul forever. Please, take her. Her name is May, and with that final plea, the light in her eyes extinguished. She was gone. Jesse knelt in the dry, cracked earth of the creek bed, the world suddenly silent except for the soft cooing of the newborn baby in his arms. His life, just moments before a straight and predictable path, had just veered into uncharted territory. This wasn't a choice he had made. It was a responsibility thrust upon him by fate, by the last breath of a dying stranger. He couldn't undo it. He couldn't just walk away. As he held the impossibly small infant, something happened inside his chest. A profound shift, like tectonic plates moving deep within him. Something broke open. Something he never knew was sealed shut. A wall he had built around his heart for years crumbled into dust. He stood up slowly, the weight of the baby feeling both immense and insignificant. Gently, he tucked the baby inside his worn leather coat. Against the warmth of his own body, a fragile promise against the cold world. He was not the same man who had walked into this creek bed just minutes ago. That man was gone, lost to the past as surely as the young woman at his feet. He didn't know who this new man was, what he was capable of, or what the future held. The path ahead was shrouded in fog, uncertain and daunting. But as he looked down at the sleeping face of the child named May, one thing became crystal clear. A single unshakable truth that settled in his bones. He was not putting her down, ever. This was no longer just his journey, it was theirs. He had no map, no supplies for a baby, no idea what to do next. All he had was a promise whispered into the dust and a tiny life depending on him. He took a deep breath, the dry air burning his lungs, and turned his back on the past. He started walking not towards the town he'd come from, but towards a new horizon, a new life he never asked for but would now defend with every fiber of his being. The weight in his coat was his new compass, his new purpose. He walked for what felt like hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Every so often he'd stop, check on the baby, his rough, calloused fingers clumsy as he adjusted the makeshift blanket. She slept peacefully, oblivious to the dramatic turn her life had just taken, her little chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Each breath she took was a testament to her mother's final sacrifice, a sacrifice Jesse now felt bound to honor. He thought about the woman, about the desperation and love in her eyes. He hadn't known her, but he would carry her memory with him always. He would make sure May knew about the mother who loved her enough to trust a complete stranger. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, he saw the faint lights of a small settlement in the distance. A flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He knew walking into town with a newborn baby and no explanation would raise questions, suspicious looks. People in these parts were wary of strangers, and a man alone with a baby was a story that wrote itself, usually with a bad ending, but he had to try. May needed milk. She needed a real blanket. She needed more than he could give her out here in the wilderness. He adjusted the baby in his coat, her warmth a constant reminder of his new reality. He squared his shoulders. He had faced down armed men, stared into the eyes of predators, and survived things that would break lesser men. But this was different. This was a fear that was deeper, more primal. The fear of failing this innocent child. It was a fear that also gave him a strength he'd never known. He was no longer just Jesse, the drifter, the man with no ties. He was a guardian. A protector. He was May's. He approached the edge of town, the sounds of life growing louder, a dog barking, the distant tune of a piano, the murmur of voices. He paused under the shadow of a large oak tree, gathering his thoughts, trying to piece together a plausible story. But the truth, as raw and unbelievable as it was, felt like the only option. He would tell them what happened. He would face their judgment. For May, he would face anything. He looked down at her again. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, big and dark and full of a profound trust that humbled him. In that moment he knew, this wasn't the end of his freedom. It was the beginning of his salvation. He took a final, steadying breath and walked into the light. The first person he saw was an old woman sweeping the porch of a general store. She looked up as he approached, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse, "I need help." He slowly opened his coat, revealing the sleeping baby. The woman's expression softened instantly. The caution melted away, replaced by a deep, maternal concern. She put down her broom and moved towards him, her hands outstretched. "Oh, you poor thing," she whispered, her words directed not at him, but at the baby. "Come inside, son. Come inside out of the cold." In that simple act of kindness, Jesse felt the first crack of dawn in his long, dark night. The journey would be hard, he knew that. But for the first time, he realized he might not have to walk it alone. He followed her into the warm, lamplit store, a new chapter of his life, of their life, beginning. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing for more. He rode into Bitter Creek, Colorado, with a weight on his chest he'd never known. Tucked inside his coat, a baby. He called her May. He didn't know why. For 2 hours, she slept. A small, warm presence against his heart. One afternoon, as he repeated his plan for the dozenth time, panicked, he stopped at the first farmhouse he saw, a light glowing like a promise in the window. A woman with kind, weary eyes opened the door. Her name was Nora Potts. She saw the horse. She saw the grime on his face, but then her eyes landed on the tiny red, wailing face peeking out from his coat. For a moment she stepped back, her expression unreadable. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said, her voice firm. "Come in before that child freezes to death." Inside, the warmth of a wood stove hit him. Nora didn't ask questions. She simply took charge. She showed him how to feed May, warming milk in a small pan. She took a clean cloth, dipped it in the milk, and showed him how to let the baby suckle from it, how to hold her head just right, cradled in the crook of his arm. He was a man who knew how to handle a gun, a horse, a deck of cards. That night, he sat in a rocking chair by the fire, May finally asleep on his chest. The house was quiet except for the crackle of the flames and the soft rhythm of the baby's breath. He looked down at her perfect miniature face, her tiny fingers curled into a fist. More afraid than facing a drawn pistol, more afraid than staring down a posse, this was a fear that settled deep in his bones. He stayed 3 days in Bitter Creek, a guest in Nora's quiet home. A good home with a mother and a father, someone better suited to raise a child. "Someone who isn't me," he'd mutter. He was a wanted man after all. A life on the run was no life for a baby. Nora would just listen, her hands busy kneading dough or mending a shirt. His plan for the dozenth time, she stopped and looked at him. "Is that what you want, Jesse?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he said, too quickly. His plan for the dozenth time, she stopped and looked at him. "Is that what you want, Jesse?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he said, too quickly. "Of course it is. It's what's best for her." His hand resting gently on the baby's back, a look of pure awe on his face. They were perfect. Everything he wasn't. As they cooed at the baby, something happened inside his chest. It was a sharp, painful pull, like a rope being yanked tight around his heart. He couldn't breathe. He thanked the Millers for coming, told them he would think about it, his voice sounding hollow and distant to his own ears. That night he couldn't sleep. He saw the Millers' faces, saw May in their arms, safe and loved. He saw a future for her that was clean and bright, a future he could never give her. He was Jesse Cord, a wanted man. 2 posters, 4 territories. He can't register a baby with his real name. He can't offer a child anything but a life of looking over her shoulder. He went through every single reason to let May go. Every reason was logical, every reason was true. And not one of them changed the simple, impossible fact that had taken root in his soul. He couldn't do it. The thought of walking away from her was more terrifying than any marshal's bullet. The next morning, he walked into Nora's kitchen. The sun was just starting to crest the hills. Nora was already there, a cup of coffee waiting for him on the table. He didn't sit down. "I'm keeping her," he said, the words feeling both foreign and absolutely right. Nora looked at him, and a slow smile spread across her face. "I know," she said. "I've known since that first night." The problem, of course, was still simple and deadly serious. How could a wanted man raise a child? He told Nora his plan, or what little of a plan he had. He'd go south. Find a new town, a new name. How could a wanted man raise a child? He told Nora his plan, or what little of a plan he had. He'd go south. Find a new town, a new name. Get honest work. And she looked back at him with those ancient, all-knowing newborn eyes. And suddenly, not knowing had stopped being a reason not to try. Nora didn't argue. She didn't question. She moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a deep, unspoken understanding. When it was time to leave, she walked him to the door. The air was crisp and cold. She reached up and held his face between her worn, gentle hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You will make mistakes, Jesse," she said, her voice soft but strong. "Every parent does. You'll fall down. You'll get it wrong. The ones who love them, they just get up and try again." Jesse couldn't speak. A lump the size of a fist was lodged in his throat. He just nodded, his eyes burning. He settled May inside his coat, her warmth a familiar comfort now. He mounted his horse and rode out of Bitter Creek without looking back. Behind him lay 17 years of wrong turns, bad choices, and a life lived in shadows. Ahead, the open road. And inside his coat, a new life, a new purpose. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing for more tales of the heart and the human spirit. We'll see you next time. He rode south for 2 weeks, with May sleeping inside his coat most of the way. Every few hours he'd stop to feed her warm milk from a tin he carried, letting her suck on a cloth soaked in it. He talked to her while he rode. He wasn't sure why. She couldn't understand a word. But the sound of his voice seemed to settle her. And if he was honest, it settled him too. He found the town he was looking for in New Mexico. A small place called Gracefield. Population, maybe 200. No telegraph office. No current wanted posters. A town small enough to start over in. He rode in on a Monday morning and gave his name as Jesse Cole. Close enough to remember. Different enough to matter. He found a room above the general store and got work at the livery stable. It was honest work, hard work, 12 hours a day, the kind that leaves no room for old habits. The owner was a man named Bart Grubb, as wide as a door and twice as solid. He looked at Jesse, then at May, and didn't ask any questions. He just said, "Can you shoe a horse?" Jesse said yes. "Start Monday," Bart replied. Any questions? He just said, "Can you shoe a horse?" Jesse said yes. "Start Monday," Bart replied. The town watched him with cautious eyes at first. Softening people. She was 3 months old now, round-faced and dark-eyed and entirely certain of her place in the world. She smiled at everyone, even the people who weren't sure about Jesse yet. She'd smile at them until they smiled back. Jesse watched this happen over and over, that May was doing more for his reputation than anything he could have said or done himself. A woman named Clara Webb ran the boarding house. She was maybe 40, practical and kind. She started watching May during the days Jesse worked. She charged him a fair price and asked nothing personal. But she watched him in the evenings when he came to collect May. She saw the way he held her. The way his whole face changed when she reached for him. One evening, Clara said quietly, "You are a good father, Mr. Cole." Jesse just looked at her. He didn't know what to do with those words. He had never been called anything good before, not once in his 34 years. He mumbled, "Thank you," and took May home. He sat in his small room above the general store, with May asleep in the wooden crate he had lined with blankets, and he thought about that word, good. He turned it over in his mind the way you turn over something unfamiliar, trying to understand its weight, trying to understand if it was true, trying to understand if it could become true, if it wasn't already. 6 months passed, then 8, then a year. May learned to sit up, then to crawl, then to pull herself upright holding Jesse's fingers. Her first word wasn't mama or dada. Her first word was horse, which made Barkrub laugh so hard he had to sit down. Jesse smiled for the rest of that day, a real smile, the kind he had forgotten he owned. But the past does not stay past. Jesse smiled for the rest of that day, a real smile, the kind he had forgotten he owned. But the past does not stay past. Not for men like Jesse Cord. Still on the trail, still patient, still coming. Jesse stood very still in the livery doorway. May was at Clara Webb's house 2 streets away. Safe, unaware, probably trying to feed her breakfast to Clara's cat. Jesse watched Marshall Cross ride slowly down the main street of Gracefield. And he felt the 14 months of honest work and real smiles. He stood very still in the livery doorway. May was at Clara Webb's house 2 streets away. Safe, unaware, probably trying to feed her breakfast to Clara's cat. Jesse watched Marshall Cross ride slowly down the main street of Gracefield. And he felt the 14 months of honest work and real smiles. And the word good pressing against the 2 wanted posters and 17 years of wrong turns. And he understood that the moment he had been outrunning since that creek bed in Wyoming had finally caught up with him. The confrontation that had been brewing for over a year was about to happen. But this was no longer a simple chase between a lawman and an outlaw. Now there was a child involved, a town that had started to accept him, and a man who was no longer the same person he was 14 months ago. What would Jesse do? Would he run again and drag an innocent baby back into a life on the trail? Now there was a child involved, a town that had started to accept him, and a man who was no longer the same person he was 14 months ago. What would Jesse do? Would he run again and drag an innocent baby back into a life on the trail? Or would he stand his ground and face the consequences of his past to protect the future he had just started to build? Thank you for watching this part of our story. We're getting closer to the heart of this tale, and we can't wait to share what happens next. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss the next chapter. See you then. He didn't run. For 17 long years, running had been his answer to absolutely everything. Every problem, every fear, every ghost from his past. But now May was just 2 streets away and Jesse Cord stood frozen in the livery doorway. He did not run. He took a breath, turned, and walked. He walked with a purpose he hadn't felt in nearly 2 decades, all the way to Clara Webb's house. He knocked. The door swung open and there was Clara with little May balanced perfectly on her hip. The moment May saw him, her world lit up. Both her tiny arms reached out for him, a gesture of pure, absolute certainty. Jesse took her, pulling her close, burying his face in her hair for just a second. He held her tight and said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, "There is a marshal in town. His name is Harlan Cross." He paused, the next words feeling like stones in his throat. "The name I gave when I came here, it's not my real name." He braced himself for the shock, the anger, the fear. But Clara just looked at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I know," she said simply. "I've known for 8 months. Bart Grubb knew even before I did." Clara seemed to read his thoughts. "We watched you, Jesse," she explained. "Every single day for 14 months. We watched who you were with her." She glanced down at May, who was now playing with a button on Jesse's shirt, completely content. "And we decided that was the man we knew. That man right there. Not some name on a piece of paper tacked to a wall somewhere." Jesse couldn't speak. The words caught in his throat, a mix of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. For 17 years, he'd been a shadow, a name on a wanted poster. But here, in this small town, they had seen him. The real him, the man he was trying to be, the father. Clara's voice was gentle when she asked, "What are you going to do?" He looked down at May, into those dark, certain eyes that had looked at him the exact same way since he first found her by that creek bed in Wyoming. For 17 years, he'd been a shadow, a name on a wanted poster. But here, in this small town, they had seen him. The real him, the man he was trying to be, the father. Clara's voice was gentle when she asked, "What are you going to do?" He looked down at May, into those dark, certain eyes that had looked at him the exact same way since he first found her by that creek bed in Wyoming. He'd seen every kind of man walk through his door, the guilty, the innocent, the liars, and the desperate. But this was different. This wasn't a cornered animal. This was a man standing on his own 2 feet by his own choice. The silence in the small office was thick. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each second marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. He'd seen every kind of man walk through his door, the guilty, the innocent, the liars, and the desperate. But this was different. This wasn't a cornered animal. This was a man standing on his own 2 feet by his own choice. This was a man standing on his own 2 feet by his own choice. The silence in the small office was thick. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall, desperate. But this was different. This wasn't a cornered animal. This was a man standing on his own 2 feet by his own choice. The silence in the small office was thick. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each second marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. He thought of Clara's steady gaze, a look that offered not judgment, but understanding. He thought of Bart Grubb and the rest of this town, a community that had seen. He thought of Clara's steady gaze, a look that offered not judgment, but understanding. He thought of Bart Grubb and the rest of this town, a community that had seen a fugitive and decided to see a father instead. They hadn't turned him in. And so he stood there before the law, his past laid bare. He thought of Clara's steady gaze, a look that offered not judgment, but understanding. He thought of Bart Grubb and the rest of this town, a community that had seen a fugitive and decided to see a father instead. They hadn't turned him in. And so he stood there before the law, his past laid bare. He thought of Clara's steady gaze, a look that offered not judgment, but understanding. He thought of Bart Grubb and the rest of this town, a community that had seen a fugitive and decided to see a father instead. They hadn't turned him in. And so he stood there before the law, his past laid bare. We love exploring characters who make difficult choices and find their way in the world. Let me know in the comments what you think Jesse's future holds. We'll see you in the next one. We love exploring characters who make difficult choices and find their way in the world. Let me know in the comments what you think Jesse's future holds. We'll see you in the next one. Marshall Cross listened as Jesse told him everything. Every job, every wrong turn, every choice, and then the draw in Wyoming. The cottonwood trees, the young woman. The 3 words she said, "Please, take her. Her name is May." When Jesse finished, Cross looked at the poster on the desk and then back at Jesse and said, "I have been doing this work for 19 years. I have brought in a lot of men. I have never once had one walk through my door with his hands up asking me to find his daughter someone good." Cross stood up and said, "I am going to recommend to the federal judge a full pardon on both counts against you personally. I cannot promise the judge will agree, but I can tell you I have never lost a recommendation yet." Jesse asked, "And May?" Cross said, "May stays with her father." Jesse walked back to Clara Webb's house and knocked. Clara opened the door and May saw him and reached out with both arms the way she always did. He took her and held her close and said, "We are staying." Clara nodded and went inside to put the coffee on. Jesse stood in the doorway in the morning light of Gracefield, New Mexico, with May's small hands holding his collar, and thought about the draw in Wyoming, and the young woman with the desperate eyes and the 3 words that had changed everything. He had been the worst possible man for the job. Wanted in 4 territories, 17 years of bad choices. He had no right to say yes, but he had said yes anyway, and it had saved him. May leaned back and looked at his face with those dark, certain eyes and said, "Horse." Jesse laughed, a real laugh. The kind that comes all the way up from where the real things live. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded it is never too late to become who you were supposed to be. Subscribe and turn on the bell for a new Western story every single week. Leave a comment and tell us what was the moment that got you. We read every single comment. This channel exists because of you. God bless. We will see you in the next story.